Hey everybody, welcome back. So typically, we're talking to reptile keepers. Today is kind of geared towards everybody, whether you keep animals or not. And the statement comes up sometimes that it's cruel to keep animals in captivity. Well, there's a lot of different things that go into that outside of what you might think. So for those of you that don't keep animals, definitely stick around. There's some other sides to that conversation that folks need to be aware of. And for those of you that keep animals, especially reptiles and stuff that's not mainstream, there's a lot more benefit to it than a lot of us maybe think indirectly from keeping our animals. So that's what we're going to talk about today on Intrepid Exotics. Whether you're a lifelong keeper or just getting started, help us encourage responsible keeping, conservation, and public education in the interest of keeping our reptiles safe and healthy as we protect them for future generations. You're invited to spend time with us as we experience these awesome animals together on Intrepid Exotics. Now there's a lot of things that are knee-jerk responses to people that maybe don't keep animals, or are cat dog owners that really don't understand reptile keepers and things like that. And of course, one of the biggest things that hits the news is the invasive species problem. Down in Florida, of course, there's a Burmese python. Off into the oceans, there's off the coast of Florida, there's the lionfish that are just multiplying and eating everything up. There's zebra mussels in different areas. There's all kinds of different invasive species. That includes plants too. There's invasive plants. It's not just confined to animals. But that's one concern of keeping some of these animals as pets, or establishing captive breeding programs, is the possibility of them getting released into the wild. Now another thing that we'll hear is it's just inhumane to bring these animals into captivity. It's so terrible for the animals, and from an animal welfare perspective, people will bring that up a lot of times. And there's another point of concern about going out into the wild and bringing animals in, reducing the natural populations, and thus putting those populations in jeopardy. So the first thing we'll talk about is whether it's humane or not. And in order to really address that properly, we've got to look at what their situation is in the wild. I mean, to use snakes as an example, pretty much the same pressures apply to any animal that you can think of that's out in the wild. And anything that's wild is subject to, of course, climate change. Some of these animals are really climate, temperature, humidity sensitive and things like that. As their environment changes, that's a pressure on them. The amount of ecosystem they have, the amount of territory that they've got, through development, we're constantly shrinking their habitats, and that reduces the food supply. It condenses animals into tighter packs, and we'll go into that a little bit later. But they've also got diseases to worry about. They've got predators. It's not uncommon to find snakes out in the wild that have got really bad parasitic infections. You can see right here one of the snakes that was found in Australia with it just covered in ticks. So there's health concerns. There's constant predation, because all except for the largest snakes on the planet, for every snake that's out in the wild, there's something else that wants to eat it. That's just the food chain. Reptiles are a part of that. So there's all of these pressures on these animals in the wild. Now, when we bring these animals into captivity, it's an entirely different conversation. Those of us that keep reptiles, we make sure, of course, these animals don't have to worry about predation. They're safe from that pressure. The environmental changes, they're safe from that because, we use our heaters, our lighting, and our thermostats to mimic their natural environments as much as we can and give them a nice, stable environment for them to live in. So that pressure's gone. The scarcity of food isn't a problem. We feed our animals regularly. They get on a nice schedule. The prey that they get is typically from another breeder, and those animals are free of parasites and healthy, so they're getting a good diet. They get veterinary care. If they have any kind of a problem or something that comes up, they get taken care of. And through generations of captive breeding with these animals, they begin to become socialized. If you take an animal out of the wild and bring it in, probably not going to affect that animal's instinct in its lifespan. But as you breed these animals into captivity, they get more accustomed to human contact, they get more socialized, they get less dangerous. And all in all, if you're looking at a captive animal that's cared for properly compared to something that's out in the wild, that animal has a much better life. I use the example of the prairie dogs often. I've got 2 prairie dogs here. And in the wild, prairie dogs have got a lifespan of 3 to 5 years. There's a lot of pressure on them from the environment as far as predation and things like that. They're pretty much food for everything. When you bring them into captivity, that lifespan extends to about 10 years. And of course, all of the same things apply to that too. So, logically, you can't necessarily say that bringing an animal into captivity in and of itself is inhumane, because those animals do have a more comfortable life in captivity. Now, there are benefits to being out in the wild. We as human beings just can't imagine being in captivity, the thought of going to jail or something like that. And I think that's how we relate things a lot of times when we're talking about animals, where they think they're confined and caged up and so forth. But as you interact and you start to offer these animals enrichment and things like that, let them get out, move around, all of this stuff, and once they get comfortable with us, that enrichment goes a long ways. If we're looking at some of the benefits of keeping animals in captivity, one thing that absolutely needs to be addressed is what's happening to their natural habitats. We have got such a boom of construction in so many areas that the ecosystems are just being chewed into by human beings. And if you've got an area of 1 square mile, and say that area supports 100 of a particular species, the range that those animals need in order to eat and forage and so forth. Once you cut their habitat in half, and now you've got a half-mile area, all those same animals condense into the middle, and eventually they're going to really start disrupting the ecosystem, because they're going to be predating more heavily in that area. It's going to set the balance off. Those animals are either going to start dying off for lack of food, or they're going to overconsume and eliminate their food source and then die off as a result. And we have got such a long list of animals that are on the endangered species list. And I'm going to go ahead and run this right now. This is just me pulling up the list of all the endangered and threatened animals. And let this scroll for a second. So when we're talking about threats to our wildlife, there is no greater threat than human beings. All of these animals on this list all live in ecosystems that we are constantly shrinking. Now, how does this apply to keeping animals? As we cut into their habitats, they've got to go somewhere. You hear of all of these places where, well, this place is just overrun with deer. You can't drive around at night without hitting a deer. It's not that the deer are just overpopulating the area. It's that the places that they've got to go is shrinking. So you get the same number in a smaller area, and they try to migrate. They try to move to different areas in search of food, different breeding activities and things like that, and they're just crossing human areas because there's no place that doesn't have human areas. So what we see as overpopulation is just a real life depiction of that area shrinking and the number of animals in that area staying the same, so the concentration's heavier. As we look at the animals that are in these environments that we're losing, that we're getting ready to lose, if we want to maintain this, we've got to learn how to cohabitate with these animals. We've got to put a concerted effort into helping to maintain the populations of these. So one example is crested geckos. Really popular in the reptile hobby right now. A lot of people have them. There's thousands of them out there. But in the 90s, that animal was thought to be extinct until they found, a small thriving population of them. They started captive breeding, and that captive breeding has just kept going, and it's really pulled that entire species out of extinction. And we're going to be seeing more and more of these things as we go. The more human beings expand, the less room there are for the wildlife. And even as we talk about things like predators, big predators that are a threat to human beings, you see it with the wolf populations, tiger populations, bears. All of these animals are a threat to people, and as we move into their habitat, they start to encounter us more often. And of course, we're not going to let ourselves get killed by these animals if we can help it. So that animal is going to end up paying just for the fact that he was out looking for food, just for the fact that he's trying to maintain his natural territory. And now all of a sudden we start building houses in it. He's done nothing wrong, but he comes up into your yard, scares you, and they get shot. Or they end up in a trap or something like that. So whether we like it or not, keeping animals in captivity is something that we need to do. We have got to, have people that want to breed these animals, that want to learn about them, that want to bring them in, because, this list of endangered and threatened species is getting longer. It's not getting shorter. When you kind of look at the life cycle of our planet, this is a really good portrayal of it. One thing that you will notice is there's not a human being in this depiction here. There's not a house, there's not a parking lot, there's not a hotel, there's not a football stadium. Our planet is what sustains us. We need the water, we need the air, and we need the food. And this is what provides that. Now, when we start going in, cutting down the trees that are producing our oxygen, disrupting the watersheds, polluting the watersheds, driving animals to the point of extinction, this entire thing gets set off balance. And no matter how much money land developers want to make, if it's not done responsibly and we maintain what we've got, we're not likely to survive it ourselves. If we start wiping out all the plants and animals, I'm not 100% convinced we're going to have the technology to feed ourselves another way before that happens. So for those of us that keep animals, these are all things for us to keep in mind. Things for us to research on our own, become really knowledgeable about, and be able to share with people that don't keep these animals, and help them generate an understanding too. For those of you that don't keep any animals, particularly those of you that think like keeping reptiles is weird and stuff like that, these are all things to take into consideration. Reptiles are part of the environment, they're part of the ecosystem, they're part of the food chain, and they deserve a chance to thrive just like anything else does. And like I said, one of the ways that we do that is having these animals in captivity, and we do our best to mimic their environment. And the breeding programs are, like I said, bringing some of these species back from the brink of extinction. Plus all of the keepers that are working with these animals are educating themselves that much more on the animals, on the habitats, on where they come from. It motivates people to get really involved in the sciences, to learn about their animals, to learn about lighting and heating and metabolism and reproduction and all of these other things. There's so much stuff that goes into it. It's not just as simple as I want a snake, so I'm going to have one. And that's where some of the gap is that we want to bridge between reptile keepers and non-reptile keepers, is that there's a lot more to it. And it's not just, a lot of people talk about defending our rights to keep these animals. I would claim that it really is our responsibility at this point, because we've destroyed enough of their world. They're moving into our world, and we're blaming them for it. And we're driving species to extinction. And, through us building relationships with these animals and raising them. And of course, one thing that we see a lot, organizations like USARK and USARK Florida are constantly battling against laws, battling against bans of certain animals and things like that. When the truth of the matter is that with only the smallest exceptions to places like the Everglades or Hawaii, most of the time, anybody that's keeping reptiles is in an area where that reptile's probably not going to survive even if it escaped. They talk about the environmental threats. Well, you can't cookie cutter everything, because the United States is a big place. It's got all kinds of different climates in it. And reptiles, they're desert animals. They're tropical animals. You can get reptiles that will thrive up in the more moderate climates and things like that. But if you're talking about something like monitor lizards, big snakes, things of that nature, you get outside of really specific areas of the country, they're not going to survive. They're not a threat to that environment. They're not adapted to it. So when people are talking about these bans and cities and states wanting to outlaw keeping certain animals, most of the time that's not based in science. There's really no good reason that they can present for wanting to ban these animals. The simple fact of the matter is that they don't understand it. And it's something that they can do to curry favor with somebody. Whether it be for votes, whether it be for money, or a combination of the two, which is typically what it is. These bans, I would say 98% of them probably that you see aren't based in a science that provides a rationale for the ban. Which is why they come up and, the organizations that work for us knock them down almost every single time. Because as soon as you apply public scrutiny to it, it falls apart. And like I said, it's not just our right to keep these animals. We've got a responsibility to help maintain what wildlife we've got left. I'm sure most of you have probably heard 98, 99% of the animals that have lived on this planet have gone extinct. If you look at from the beginning all the way to now. And what we have now is just such a small fraction of a percentage of what has ever existed before. And we're cutting into the places where it lives, and we're putting those in danger of extinction even quicker. So I hope this helped put some things into perspective. If you guys have any questions, comments, by all means, get down there, throw them in there. If we get enough of a conversation going, maybe we could address those things in a follow-up video or something like that. But this is just kind of something I wanted to touch on, because it's really important right now that us as human beings are able to bridge our understanding between the people that keep and the people that don't, and get us all on the same page. Because all of us are impacting these animals. All of us are putting them at risk. And even though all of us aren't going to be working to mitigate that risk, we really need to make sure that the people that are not being impeded for unjustifiable reasons. So it's really a discussion that needs to be had, and it's one that needs to be continued. So for those of you that are interested, I'm going to put 2 playlists in the end screen, one on reticulated pythons and the almost complete playlist for the Nile monitor. I'm also going to put one video in there in regards to the situation down in Florida, if you're not familiar with that. It's definitely something everybody needs to be aware of. And, you know, go from here, check some of that stuff out, and let's start working together on this. Keepers and non-keepers, like I said, it's our responsibility to make sure that we're not killing everything on the planet. And captive keeping, captive breeding has and will continue to rescue some of these species from going extinct. So you guys have an outstanding day, and we'll see you next time on Intrepid Exotics.